Okay, in this video today, I'm interviewing Danny Lennon, host of Sigma Nutrition Radio, the very, very popular nutrition science podcast, starting back all the way in 2014. So he's very, very experienced as the interviewer, but today he was the interviewee. And this is taken from highlights of the Sports Nutritionist podcast. Now, before I forget, so I can get this through in the intro, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you do not miss video updates that we have associated with the Sports Nutrition Association. Danny is, as I said before, the host of the successful Sigma Nutrition Radio podcast. He also has a master's in nutritional sciences, and he is also an advisory board member of the Sports Nutrition Association. In this, like we always focus on a little bit within the Sports Nutritionist podcast, we talk about his career to date and what his professional career has been like up until this point, what his academic career has been like up until this point. So we'll look a little bit into that.
When I went to university first, I studied science education, which is a course to become essentially a science teacher here in Ireland. So I did biology and physics as my two main subjects. And alongside that, you do a teaching diploma. On graduating with that, I became a secondary school or high school teacher of science and maths, which I did for a year. Going into college, started doing a bit of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, dabbled in a bit of MMA, but mainly jiu-jitsu is my thing. At the time when I started studying science in university, that was the first time I came across, there's these things called research papers. And so then as this kind of hobby on the side, I started looking, maybe there's these research papers about things I'm interested in. Like sport performance and how to get better. So decided at that point to quit teaching at the end of that school year. Went back and did a master's degree in nutritional sciences because I said, I'm really interested in this stuff. And after doing a master's degree, still wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen. Started thinking, maybe doing some nutrition consultancy would now be a good idea. And said, if I'm going to have a consultancy, I need to have some way of people finding me or putting out some degree of content. And that's when I started writing some articles, was going to do some like YouTube videos. Then I said, I'll do this podcasting. Podcast took off really well, and everything that's came since that has probably been off the back of that. Being able to do like the seminars that I've done, be able to put out the weight cutting guide, being able to get access to other people's platforms and our whole coaching services. Everything has been probably based off the fact that the podcast became successful when it was.
So then along the way after he graduated, he then started to work with fighters and then started to get into the whole combat sports side of things. So I'll let Danny elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so this is another example of where just things happened without me planning too much. So one of my friends, and I was working alongside them essentially, and one of the strengthening and conditioning coaches there, Jason, that I knew, had been doing S&C work with a few fighters. And one of them, he wanted to put in touch with me to help do their nutrition and manage their weight cuts for upcoming fights. So started working with him. It seemed to go well early on. And so through word of mouth, a number of other fighters that knew him started contacting me, and I started working with more and more of them. And as I did that kind of forced me to consider more about some of the practices that are typically done, see how little evidence we actually have for that, and then try and piece together, what would be a suitable approach to some of this stuff. And then started writing down some of those thoughts and putting those out a bit more online.
Then he shed some light as to how Sigma Nutrition Radio actually started. And coincidentally enough, it was something that started on the back of a bit of a business incentive program that was linked to a university.
And so I felt like I wanted to get into nutrition consultancy or nutrition coaching. Really, I just decided, there's very little around going that way, especially if you've no experience. I need to start actually coaching some people here. And so during my time in college, I'd been doing some coaching, just taking on people I knew or friends of friends and just building up some experience that way. After finishing the degree and doing that for a number of months, I actually applied to a business accelerator program where they take on 10 companies a year. And with that, you get a small amount of capital up front to help build the business that you can put into what you want. And then you get weekly workshops around building a business essentially, with the idea of kind of scaling it. To get into a program like that, it obviously wasn't going to be now a consultancy business. And so I kind of pitched basically an online format of putting out nutrition science information, maybe like small videos and so on, but like an online library of sorts of that was this initial idea that I pitched to them, but without too much idea of what I was doing or where I was going. Like I didn't have a big master plan, but it worked out being good enough that they selected me to go into that program.
So after we'd really unpacked things as it related to working with professional MMA athletes and boxers, and then getting a really successful podcasting and nutrition radio program off the ground and how long that took, we really started unpacking the concepts behind, or a concept that I really like to talk about, which is your success is predicated from the amount of skill that you have at a certain point in time. And we've got this skill and timing continuum that we're working from. And so how Danny possessed the requisite skill at the time to be one of the very first nutritional science and evidence-based nutritional science communicators, and why his timing of having and completing his master's in nutrition science was really relevant to his success at that point in time.
People want to paint a picture that it's just about hard work, and hard work is indeed an important ingredient, particularly if you're going to start a venture or project yourself. But hard work alone might be completely futile if someone puts hard work into the wrong thing that they just don't have the skills for. I think for most people, it's really useful to be self-aware of, okay, what skills do I have? And then thinking about where that might be unique. And David Epstein, I suppose, has become one of the people who's familiar with this idea of where people that have like these meandering career paths or have a background in something that seemingly is not related to a field that they end up getting into can actually outperform people who have focused on a very narrow thing for their entire life. And there's a value of not only learning different skills, but there's also then, if you are trying to be unique in some way, you need to maybe marry up two different things that don't always come together.
So along with the concept of possessing a certain amount of skill and then having that skill at the right point in time, there's a little bit of luck associated with that. Another aspect of this, and a part of the skill component, is really being aware of what's responding at the time. So that way you can lean further into it and dive further into it. So we unpack that a little bit more as well.
People tend to not like some of my views on this topic because I often say that it is all luck, as opposed to just some of it being luck. If, for example, people think I'm able to articulate things pretty well, or I was able to go and get a master's degree, or whatever they might point to, at some point they are still just luck, that had nothing to do with me, just genetically or socially determined, that are just luck. We can acknowledge where there's obviously a bit of luck around the timing of deciding to do a podcast at that time, and then the luck being not knowing that 3 years later podcasts would just explode like they did in the end of 2016, start of 2017. I didn't start a podcast because I was predicting that. I just started podcasts because I liked listening to them. And I think the thing you said is right, of seeing what happens when you just start trying to do something, and probably having a certain period of time where you're like, okay, I'll see how this goes, I'll give it my best effort, but then be able to adapt from it, right? It's like, there's no point in me saying, oh, I set out to do a podcast and I was going to do that no matter what, or I was going to work with fighters no matter what. Actually, that would have been terrible to do. Like, I could have started doing it and realized, let's say I did a few YouTube videos, and let's say they exploded for whatever reason and the podcast wasn't doing anything. Well, in that case, I probably, who knows, like, why would I have continued to podcast and stop doing YouTube altogether? It would probably be the other way around.
You'd be the Jeffrey part of
what people are responding to.
Now, while it may look like these things are some really overnight success stories, and Danny's had a really, really good career to date, which he has, I get him to explain the timeline and full scope of his work. So when things took off with Sigma, stepped down from working with clients, and then stepped down from working with professional athletes to be in the position that he is now in today.
When I started taking on people to kind of build a bit of experience, I'd started doing a bit of writing as well. I think it's another skill to practice, but it started the ball rolling of actually writing about ideas around nutrition. So that was that time point. And then the podcast launched on the 1st of April, 2014. I think it was probably sometime 2016. By that time point, I still had clients myself when I started doing that. It's just, we had enough demand that I needed
to bring in extra help.
It was once I'd done that, then the process became, okay, now over time, as new applications come in, I'll make sure the other coaches are full. And then when it gets to the point where they're completely full, we can take on someone else, but rather than me taking on new applications.
And eventually phase yourself out. Yeah.
And then we finish with what his plan is for now and how he's approaching things from this point and being in a really well-established place as a research and scientific communicator and a really, really good content creator as it relates to evidence-based content.
The only way I think I know how to function is to work on the next couple of immediate projects. And they typically might be at the longest what's going to happen in the next year, let's say. But it could be shorter than that. It's just like, what is the next big thing that I have to work on? And then keep the podcast going and keep trying to make it better.
Like, let me ask you this. Do you still get the odd bit of imposter syndrome from time to time?
I mean, yeah, I think it's hard to know what becomes imposter syndrome and what becomes just worrying about, is this good enough? I think I'll never get rid of that feeling of, is this good enough? Could this have been better? Like, did I do my best with this? But I think I'm better at realizing that when we look at other people's work, we appraise it much more favorably than we appraise our own. And we don't notice all the potential tiny little mistakes or things that could be 1% better. But we do notice that with our own things, right? We'll read back over something and say, oh, I could have phrased that one sentence a lot better. It's like, no one will even notice, right?
So anyone who's listened to the full podcast or just caught the highlights from the segments within this video, you'll be able to get a grasp for just how humble Danny is with his own success and how much he's achieved up until this point. And so he can be used as a great example of anyone that feels like they should be at a certain point in their career or in their life to make sure that not always having the answers is okay. Leaning into the things that are responding well is an important skill set to have, so that way you can recognize the things that are responding well professionally, and that we are always going to experience a little bit of imposter syndrome, or at least be critical of ourselves along the way, and that never really stops. So if you like the video, make sure again to like, subscribe, turn notifications on. If you want to check out the full episode of the podcast, it's on iTunes and Spotify, the Sports Nutritionist Podcast, and be sure to stay tuned with what we're doing more of within the association.